Hello and welcome to Public Affairs Now, our super local look at what's going on in the Maryland General Assembly and the Arundel County Council. In this episode, we will focus on the State House as they start action on their annual 90-day session to pass the budget and debate issues that affect us all. Today we have Len Lazarick from MarylandReporter.com and Senator John Astle, Chairman of Anne Arundel County Senate Delegation. Thank you both for joining us today.
Good to be here.
Senator Astle, let's start with you. Tell our viewers a little bit about how the session works. Everyone is working on big issues affecting the entire state, like the budget, but there are also local bills from each county.
That's absolutely true. The first thing, let me just talk about the process. What's going to happen? We're all coming together. We've got new players, people that have never served in public office before, and so it's going to be a little educational process as they begin to understand how the process really works. We are going to be hearing, I think, sometime fairly quickly from the county executive about his legislative package. In fact, I had a meeting this morning with the legislative representative from the county executive to do some preliminary discussions about the kinds of things that the county executive may want. But once we get those issues, then I, along with the chairman of the House delegation, will work together with the members of our own delegations to try to bring those issues to success. That's the process.
This session is certain to be very different from previous sessions because we have a new governor and Republican and Edgewater resident, Larry Hogan. Len, how do you see the dynamic in Annapolis this year?
Well, as you say, there's a new Republican governor, and that really very much changes the dynamic. Not only is he new, but he was to certainly Democrats, it was a surprising upset. So there's a certain amount of adjustment going on in Democratic circles about how to deal with this governor. You also have 50 members of the House of Delegates behind us who are Republicans, the largest number of Republicans that have ever served in the House of Delegates ever in history. And they partly got that way by defeating some of the moderate Democrats, frankly people like Senator Astle on the House side. And the Democrats who got elected are, to a certain extent, more progressive, more left than the people that they replaced. So it's going to be very interesting to see how Governor Larry Hogan interacts with these folks. He has certainly depicted himself as a moderate Republican and has emphasized bipartisanship, but as the senator says, there's a big learning curve. There are the kind of budget issues that have come up repeatedly in the past, but we'll have to see how the Democratic legislature reacts to the Republican governor. So this session probably, we've had the most turnover we've had in 20 years in the General Assembly. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out over the next 90 days.
You know, I might just take exception to one thing that you said, Len, with regard to the Republicans that survived, at least on the Senate side. I mean, the Democrats that survived, at least on the Senate side, tend to be the more conservative Democrats. There were some moderates that were defeated in the election, but I think for those of us that are still standing, we tended to be.
Yeah, I was really referring to the House side,
okay.
where
well, there's some districts where some can be so progressive they can do things that I could never think of doing in Anne Arundel County.
Yeah.
And what about you, Senator Astle? What is the mood like in Annapolis with a new governor, and how do you think things will be different?
Well, we had a Democratic caucus right after the election, and the President of the Senate said to us, you know, we're going to work with this guy. We have to work to make government successful in what we're attempted to be about. I had another friend of mine say the other day, it's going to be easier for me to work with a moderate Republican than a progressive Democrat. So I think the mood, at least on the Senate side, is we want to work with the governor to achieve the goals that he set out. We all live here in this community. We all benefit or not, depending on what comes out of this session.
So it's probably true that Governor Hogan will get along with the Senate better. There's a long-standing relationship that Mike Miller talks about, knowing not just Larry Hogan, but his father, Larry Hogan Sr., from the 1960s, and that the Senate acts as a more moderating influence. I think there might be more difficulties in the House, and the House is dealing with the budget first. But we really don't, it's one thing to talk about being bipartisan and reaching out, and it's another thing actually to do it and make it happen. I mean, talk is easy, as any senator can tell you.
Talk is easy. Well, I think there was a clear message from the electorate that they want to see some changes in Annapolis, and so I think, at least on the Senate side, we're going to be working in that direction.
Every year, the budget is the primary focus of the session, and this year is no different. Len, everybody in Annapolis is aware that there is a large structural deficit to deal with. Any idea how this problem will be addressed?
Well, the problem has to be addressed the way it always is, by you have to cut some things. So the thing about a structural deficit means there are things that we have promised to do or that we're expected to do through funding formulas or mandates that would cause us to spend X amount of dollars. Every year, and this has occurred for at least the last 12 years, there's a thing called the BRFA, Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, that takes these formulas and adjusts them so they don't have to spend as much money as they promised. And there's also inflation there. The structural deficit is based on the idea of giving employees salary increases. So there are a whole bunch of things that create the potential deficit. But the other thing about Larry Hogan's promises is that he wants to roll back some taxes. And he has just recently reiterated that he is going to have some kind of tax cut. Now, that may be small and symbolic. We haven't seen anything. The policy of the Hogan transition team is actually no policy discussion. That they really aren't discussing anything, and the governor-elect says, well, I'll talk about it in my inauguration, and then 24 hours later after his inauguration, he's going to release his budget. And that's where we're going to learn the first real stuff about what Governor Larry Hogan's going to do.
Senator Astle, you are a veteran of the General Assembly now with almost 3 decades of service in the House and Senate. This year we have 6 new delegates. What kind of surprises are they in for?
Well, anecdotally, I'm hearing stories that some of them don't really understand the process, and they're going to discover who's in charge. I had a discussion the other day with somebody about somebody that's coming to the Senate, not necessarily in Anne Arundel County, because all the senators in Anne Arundel came back, but this was a senator from another part of the state who was asked, well, what committee are you going to be on when you come down? And he said, committee? I'm not coming down to be on a committee. I'm coming to the Senate. Well, I think he's going to find a rude awakening when he discovers that's not exactly how it works here, and that there is somebody in charge. So from the Anne Arundel County side, I had a conversation last night with the chairman of the House delegation, and she's going to be working with the new guys to try to help in that accommodation so that they can get their feet on the ground and figure out where they're going and what's going to happen.
Well, who is in charge?
Well, it depends on where you're talking. In the Senate, Mike Miller's in charge.
Well, thank you both for joining us, gentlemen. Before we go, Len, can you give us a brief overview of the calendar for the session?
Well, of course, we have a limited 90-day session. That's 90 calendar days. It starts the second Wednesday in January, and it will be over a Monday in April. I forget now whether it's April 12th, 13th, something like that. That's the way it works. The only thing they absolutely have to do in the session is pass a budget, and there are various timelines related to passing that budget. This year, the House of Delegates, the House Appropriations deals with the budget first. They make whatever cuts because the General Assembly in Maryland, with a strong executive budget, can only cut. They send it to the Senate. The new delegates and senators only have about a month to get their act together and put in bills. So I think this year in particular, we'll see a very slow start as people figure out where the bathrooms are and how to get their bills drafted and put in whatever proposals. And then we'll come to a crunch at the end, and there are oftentimes very difficult negotiations about the budget. It's not hard to imagine an even more difficult time if, depending on how the House and Senate are cooperating with the new governor on that. So, there's really not you'll see a lot of stories in the first month, but they don't really mean much of anything when you go back and look at them. It's really the last 60 days and the last 30 days that the most action takes place.
I'd just like to clarify one point with regard to the budget. While the House has to act on it first this year, the Senate's going to be, the Budget and Tax Committee will be working on the budget simultaneously. And so what that really means is that when the House finally brings the budget to the floor and actually enacts it on the House side, in the meantime, the House and the Senate have been talking to each other. They're pretty well aware of what's going on either
And they've
house.
both been having hearings.
Yeah, they've both been having hearings.
Hearings
And
in the
so-
small subcommittees.
So the budget will finally be voted on in the House. It'll come to the Senate. The Senate will massage it, and then it'll come to the Senate floor for a final vote. But then what happens is, and this happens every legislative session, is the conference committee, which really finally settles out how the budget's going to look at the very end.
Clearly, the session moves very quickly, and it will be over before we know it. Thank you to our guests, Senator John Astle and Len Lazarick. You can read Len's dispatches from Annapolis by subscribing to MarylandReporter.com. You can also like his Facebook page for regular updates. We'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Thanks.